So Lintz's actor center approach is the one now that I would like to explicate for a bit and explore what his theory is and why I believe it retains, still to this day, um, some 35 years after the publication of this extremely important book, tremendous relevance. Lintz's focus again is on choices and behavior, on individual and institutional actors and how they behave, how they choose, how they align, and to what extent they adhere to democratic norms and principles in the face of political crisis. How do they shape the agenda, the priorities? How do they reach out and frame the political situation to their constituencies at times of stress in the political system and very often in the economy as well? For Lintz, a very key variable is whether they are committed to democratic institutional norms and procedures, as we'll see, and how resilient and transcendent that commitment is. The key variable for Lintz is loyalty to democracy on the part of political elites, particularly elected office holders, but also party leaders and others in key places in the political system. What is loyalty? As Lintz defines it, it's a public commitment to use only legal and democratic means for acquiring power and then for exercising power. And crucially here, we see repeatedly in the study of the instances of democratic breakdown, both in the remarkable book that Juan Lintz and Alfred Stepon have edited, the 4-volume study, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, in Lintz's seminal synthetic and theoretical essay within that 4-volume work, and in many instances of democratic breakdown and the study of democratic failure since then, we see the extremely important role of using peaceful means for contesting for power, for asserting interests, for lobbying, and for expressing political voice. Rejection of the use of force, of violence, of intimidation with the threat of force. These are really an essential condition for the stability and effective functioning of democracy. And therefore, Lintz stresses this must include a rejection of any knocking at the barracks for armed forces support. In other words, knocking on the door of the military and saying as a political leader, hey, we're in a dispute here, you really should come in on my side. Once the military comes in on any side in a political dispute, it has become a political actor. And that has raised the stakes in the competition between government and opposition or between different political forces. And it has lowered the threshold for military intervention more fully in politics, in particular for a military coup. Let's look now at some examples from Lintz's study of what constitute acts of democratic disloyalty. First of all, I repeat, any use of force, fraud, or intimidation against opponents which might have underneath it the threat of force. Obviously, electoral rigging and an effort to bend or break the rules of the democratic game in order to acquire power. These are fundamental violations of the principles of democracy and acts of disloyalty to the democratic constitutional system. Second, the denial of legitimacy to political opponents who are acting in a democratic way. So any rhetoric or action that would suggest that a rival political party or rival political leader is not a legitimate player in the political system, when in fact that actor is behaving in a way that's consistent with democratic principles and loyal to the democratic constitution, is another manifestation of disloyalty to democracy, of fundamental violation of democratic principles. Then Lentz writes that another manifestation of democratic disloyalty is a readiness to curtail the civil liberties of the leaders of political parties and supporters of political parties who are attempting merely to exercise their constitutional rights. So when an elected political leader, a president, a prime minister, attempts to curtail the right of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of organization, freedom of assembly of his opponents in the political system, that is an act of disloyalty to democracy and either could be paving the way for an auto golpe, a seizure more explicitly and totally of authoritarian power by the elected ruler, or it could drive opponents of the elected government to use more extreme measures because the institutions and rules and procedures of democracy are being denied to them. Another act of democratic disloyalty is mass pressure to disrupt the functioning of government. Now, if there's been an undemocratic election, a stolen election, and citizens who have been victims of that, political parties and so on, seek to stand in front of Parliament and use nonviolent means of civil disobedience to possibly obstruct the Parliament from sitting, accepting that this is an act of civil disobedience and they might be arrested for it. I don't think I would put that in this category. But where there's been a free and fair election, there are rules and procedures for disputing the outcome of the election. And then a party, because it doesn't like the outcome of the election, seeks to boycott Parliament or deny the political system the legitimacy and functionality it deserves in a democracy, that is an act of disloyalty to democracy. Losers in a democracy, this is a basic principle of democracy, losers in a democracy have to accept defeat and assume the role of loyal and responsible opposition. There are few principles in a democracy that are more important than the principle of the loyal and responsible opposition. It doesn't mean you have to accept the program of the government of the day. It doesn't mean you don't compete vigorously over policies, over legislation, and in preparation for the next national election. But it does mean respecting the authority of the legitimately elected government and its right to govern. A fifth manifestation of democratic disloyalty is any blanket, wholesale, overarching attack on the whole political system, rather than attacking specific actors and institutions that you feel need reform or actors whose programs you're opposing. But when a group, a social movement, a political party is saying that the whole system is rotten and needs to go, and legitimizing by their rhetoric and legitimizing by their action even potentially violent resistance to the political system, that is, of course, a blatant act of democratic disloyalty. And look, if you go back in history, you'll see, as we find in the case study of Germany in the interwar period within the breakdown of democratic regimes study, that the Nazis were quite explicit in their contempt for the democratic system and in saying that Germany needed a different type of political system. Then there is a category of behavior that worries Juan Lentz a great deal, that he calls semi-loyal behavior. And this walks the line between clear commitment to the norms and principles of democracy, between responsible behavior as government or opposition, and blatant disloyalty to democracy in the ways I've described. It's a gray zone of opportunistic behavior in the pursuit of political power or advantage. And some of the manifestations of this are the intermittent presence in attenuated or ambivalent form of some of the elements of disloyalty. In other words, occasionally a party will use force, fraud, or intimidation. Now and then a ruling president will skirt the law and the Constitution in terms of arresting opponents who are peacefully exercising their rights of dissent and political voice, or preventing them from demonstrating. And some of these other variables that you can see here. The crucial one for Lentz, I think, more than any other, is as semi-loyal behavior, the willingness of actors, parties, political leaders, within the mainstream of the democratic system, to ally with blatantly disloyal forces, to ally with and bring into their coalition extremist forces, or to negotiate in secret with them. It is a fundamental principle of the defense of democracy in difficult times, in the midst of severe political polarization, that the political parties that profess to commit to democracy must draw clear boundaries around the political system and refuse to legitimize or do business with blatantly disloyal political parties, extremist, hateful political parties who have explicitly rejected the legitimacy of democracy, political parties with an authoritarian or totalitarian mentality, platform, or mission. Once the mainstream political parties start legitimizing the extremist forces, the country has entered a very slippery slope down toward, quite possibly, democratic failure. In addition, says Lentz, any willingness to encourage, tolerate, cover up, treat leniently, excuse, or justify actions by undemocratic political parties and leaders that violate democratic principles and norms is a very serious instance of semi-loyal behavior. Again, parties, organizations, and leaders that profess commitment to democracy, that seek to perpetuate democracy, and claim to want to defend democracy in difficult, stressful historical periods, have to draw a thick boundary around who is a legitimate player in the political process and who is not, and make it clear that those who commit undemocratic acts who steal elections, who murder their opponents, who use threatening and intimidating language, who seek to subvert the democratic loyalty of the military, are not going to be tolerated, not to mention allied with, but that the full force of the Constitution and the law will be brought to bear against their demonstrated undemocratic behavior. Not by fiat, not by impulse, but by due process of the law.